My name is Jeanne Downing. I work for USAID, and our work in value chains is largely focused on improving competitiveness and reducing poverty.
When did you first become interested in value chains, and why do you think it's an especially effective framework for use in USAID programs?
I was working with a group of people, a community of practice, and we were more linked to what started out as commodity systems in agriculture economics back in the 50s, which evolved into something called subsector and subsector analysis. And then we got involved with something called business development services. And as we were talking about these services, we realized that these services were a derived demand. In other words, it's the final product that was really so important to demand for these services. So then we began to find the research of Sussex and Gary, and developed a long-term relationship with Gary. And what we did is we took that research and translated it into practical approaches, methodologies, and tools for program development, for project development.
Okay. The summit thus far, I mean, we're through most of the day's sessions. Have you heard anything that characterized maybe in a way you hadn't thought of before? Has there been anything that surprised you? What have you taken so far from the sessions?
Well, I think at breakfast this morning, someone was summarizing last night's discussion, and they were talking about there are two camps. One camp that believes that global value chains and free trade are the way to growth, economic growth, and others who are really questioning the developmental impact of free trade and concerned about how to improve the developmental impact of global value chains. So I thought that was, I was surprised that we were even talking about free trade in that way. And I think our camp is very much looking at developmental impacts. And we have been working a lot more on domestic markets, but all of those markets are globalized. So you can't look at even staple crop markets without looking at what's happening globally. Rice is a huge global market. And I think the challenge that I see in the countries that I work in, largely in Africa, is how to make economic growth more inclusive. I see that in our country is how to make growth more inclusive. And I think that's a real challenge of value chain development. And I mean, I think the discussion here is a lot on global value chains, but there's such an interaction between domestic value chains, regional value chains, global value chains. It's, I wonder if just dividing it up is necessary and useful.
Right, that was going to lead to my follow-up question. Do you necessarily see global value chains, do you agree with the characterization maybe that you received of last night's conversation that it's on one polar end, in other words, or can it incorporate aspects of both, of social upgrading, the developmentalist camp, and also incorporating aspects of free trade? Is it something you see as being on one extreme of the free trade, or is it a bit more integrated than that?
The only question I have about free trade is to what extent it's really free, and to what extent there's a level playing field. And I think we heard today, which I thought this was a surprising thing, that there's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 firms that they are the global value chains in the whole world. Mm-hmm. And yet we just heard from Mike Morris, if you only look at trade in terms of global value chains and leave out spot markets, you're leaving out an awful lot of trade that is going on. So I think the challenge of globalization is, can globalization and global trade be good for everyone? can there be more of a level playing field? And I think one of the things that I've learned from value chains is that value chains are successful when they successfully coordinate the chain. And it's hard to successfully coordinate the chain if the suppliers at the bottom of those chains are not gaining from participating in the chains. So I think taking that to world trade, to the extent that we don't have a fair and an even playing field, we are going to have conflict. And we already see an enormous amount of conflict in the world right now. So, how can this understanding of value chains, how can we use that understanding to create economies and industries that are more inclusive?
Okay, that segues nicely into the final question. We're looking ahead to the next 3, 5, 10 years. What challenges do you see your organization addressing in the global economy, and how might the GVC framework help assess those challenges?
One of the big challenges I see in Africa, but I also see it in our own country, is this enormous and growing gap between the rich and the poor. And I know in Africa they are talking about just the enormous number of farmers in rural areas that really don't have viable concerns, and that we need to be thinking about employment. And if you can help develop and if you can facilitate the development of value chains and generate growth, can you also generate opportunities for those very poor? Maybe not in value chains, maybe in services that support value chains. But I think, thinking in these terms, thinking beyond sort of, I think AID right now is looking at sort of narrowly at these value chains, when the broader system is going to be really critical to reducing poverty. So I think that is a big challenge.